This is the Lesbian Historic Motif Podcast, brought to you by Heather Rose Jones. The show looks at lesbian and sapphic themes in history and literature, and historical fiction with queer female characters, including fantastic versions of the past. We present research, interviews, news of the field, book listings, and original historical fiction for your enjoyment. For even more historic research, check out our blog. When I set up an interview with Margaret Vandenburg about her novel, Craze, I was planning on the sort of short book release-related interview that I normally include in the On the Shelf episodes. About 10 minutes into recording, I realized that we were both having far too much fun to cut the discussion short, and decided to make the interview its own episode. Margaret Vandenburg's life parallels that of the protagonist of Craze in loose terms. Raised in a Western state, she spent time abroad, then settled in New York City. She had an academic career at Barnard College, specializing in modernism, postmodernism, and gender studies. Her fiction has covered a range of topics and settings, but today we'll be focusing on her most recent novel, about an art journalist who returns from time spent in the salons of 1920s Paris to land in the middle of queer New York during the Roaring Twenties. In the next hour, we have a wide-ranging talk about books, the cycles of history, and the meaning of queerness. So I want to welcome Margaret Vandenburg to the Lesbian Historic Motif Podcast to talk about her new book, Craze. Welcome, Margaret.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, really.
So why don't we start off by you pitching your book? Tell us a little bit about Craze.
So Craze is a novel about what George Chauncey called the pansy craze, and he coined the term in the 90s, and it's the sort of first flowering of queer culture in America. I am calling it, for obvious reasons, the queer craze in the novel, because there is an implicit erasure of us, as in lesbians, in the term pansy craze. And so it's a time that's becoming more well known when queer life in New York, which is the setting of the novel, was really much more mainstream, as it were, in a kind of paradoxical way, because Prohibition sort of thrust everybody, that is so-called straight people, slummers, people who were going into the speakeasies and the drag shows, into what would have been a queer underground, but ceased to be a queer underground because of Prohibition. So again, that paradoxically, Prohibition fueled the so-called pansy craze. And so my book is, in a way, it's a celebration of this magnificent era, but at the same time, it's kind of a cautionary tale because, as many people know, in the wake of the queer craze, there was a terrible crackdown, beginning with the end of Prohibition, ironically, with the Depression. And that crackdown lasted really until the Stonewall Uprising, and which ushered in many ways, ushered in the gay rights movement, so that the novel is also a way to think about what's happening now. That is to say, we have a kind of flowering of queer life, but also the potential, if not the reality, of another crackdown.
Yes, that was very forefront in my mind while listening to your book, which is the cyclicity of history and how, the same cycles come around again. And we had, as you say, the flowering of gay liberation, as it were, and now we're coming around again in the 20s again to a backlash. And let's just hope we can weather this one better and come through it with only half a step back.
Yeah, and I think that, I may read passages or not from the book, but I think, when you start to think about why it is that we weren't able to fight back or resist, as you know, because you're so steeped in queer history, that really at that time, queerness was not a thing in the way that it is now. And people didn't understand themselves as being part of a kind of united front yet. So they weren't equipped to fight back. And in some ways, we have to remember that even though potentially our communities are splintered right now, because they are splintered in a way, there's a little bit of turf warfare going on, but that we have come to know ourselves as a queer identity, and that can definitely, in some ways, safeguard that the same, as you call it, the cyclicity of history, that we won't fall into that same trap of not being able to stand up.
Yeah, and I think that in the Stonewall era, one of the big differences was the benefits inherited from the civil rights movement, of the idea that you can put together coalitions of people to change society.
Absolutely. And, I think we learned from that period that there is a way in which, real resistance is having skin in the game. This is what I worry about now, though, that I think queer people and African Americans, and, in particular in the United States, that is, have a kind of built-in sense memory of what it's like to put our bodies on the line. And that because of that, perhaps we're better equipped to resist because we still have that sense memory, as you say, from the civil rights movement. But at the same time, we're in this there's a kind of passivity almost built into, maybe it's a digital age thing, and that muscle memory might be waning to a certain extent. And this is sort of what I worry about.
And that's what I think of as part of the cyclicity, is getting comfortable with pseudo acceptance. So just as during Prohibition, well, everybody's breaking the law, so you're not going to look askance at specific ways of breaking the law, which I think your character brings up. But now it's, so much of the rights that queer people fought for, it's like, well, we've got it now, so we can sit back and relax. We've got it made. And I think you really see the cutting edge of the resistance coming for trans people, where they don't just have skin in the game, they are the skin in the game. And we're kind of getting off the subject here, but that sense of really needing to pull together as a community with people whose needs and desires are different from our own.
Yeah, I mean, we are getting, it's sort of like we're putting the cart before the horse, but at the same time, the thing that's at stake, the thing that's at stake takes us back to the 1920s, because it's really about what is the nature of gender fluidity. And, with transgender rights and transgender existence as we know it, this is a kind of new iteration of something that's been around for a long time, but it's much more, as they say, in the academy, it's much more reified. It's much more, part of the real world, is more of a material existence. It's not just a conceptual thing for, it's in the realm of everybody's experience. So the idea of gender fluidity, we really inherited in many ways from the 1920s, which is something that I don't think people know about the period. And it's something that, as you know, the novel really tries to think about, like, what is the nature of gender fluidity? There are these sort of critics of it, and then there are these kind of theorists of gender fluidity in the 1920s in the novel, including Magnus Hirschfeld and Virginia Woolf. Georgia O'Keeffe kind of comes into it in a certain way, thinking about gender fluidity in another way. And the crux of it, of course, then was called androgyny, as in Virginia Woolf's conception of androgyny. And I would like to read at some point a bit of her conception of androgyny. The point being that there is different ways to understand gender fluidity, and that gender fluidity is in and of itself a kind of resistance to these power structures.
Yeah, the refusal to be defined by categories.
Right, exactly.
And I noticed very much that it's a through line in the novel. Your characters focus on ambiguity and indefinability, not just for identities, but for the art that she is her professional field. And I have a hard time sort of thinking of artistic dynamics as androgyny, but I guess I can see if you're thinking in terms of contrasts and polarities that you can apply the term to all sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, there's a way. It's interesting when you say that, artistic dynamics, because I'm, if you don't mind, I'll read a little Wolf. And the thing about it is that she is talking about the intersection of art and you'll know this passage is from A Room of One's Own, the intersection between art and politics, just as there's an intersection between gender and politics. So, you know, when we say gender politics, it has to do with what are the implications of this kind of collapse of oppositions as in non-binary androgynous gender. And so she says, she's basically, and this is why it goes back to what I tried to say about the cart and the horse, which is that if you have a moment in history, speaking of the cycles of history, in which non-binary gender existence comes to the foreground, the backlash is going to cause a particular response, and that particular response is in fact fascism. So this is what she says. This is A Room of One's Own again, and this is 1929. If one is a man, still the woman part of the brain must have effect, and a woman must also have intercourse with the man in her. Coleridge perhaps meant this when he said that a great mind is androgynous. It is when this fusion takes place that the mind is fully fertilized and uses all its faculties. And then she lists various androgynous authors, including Shakespeare, Keats, etc. And then she says, ironically, quote again, "For one can hardly fail to be impressed in Rome by the sense of unmitigated masculinity. And whatever the value of unmitigated masculinity upon the state, one may question the effect of it upon the art of poetry. Poetry ought to have a mother as well as a father. The fascist poem, one may fear, will be a horrid little abortion such as one sees in a glass jar in the museum of some county town." So, you know, in a way, we jumped to the present where we have, you know, General Kelly warning us that one of our candidates might be a fascist, in part because we're in this historical moment that mirrors the Roaring Twenties, in which, again, the ascendancy of non-binary gender fluidity caused a similar backlash and caused, in the long run, the rise of fascism and, you know, Second World War and the Holocaust. So these are not the accidents of history, but it's just this predictable, cyclical crackdown against one of the most radical things in history, which is androgyny / non-binary gender politics.
So one of the things that struck me about your novel, and you know, don't take this the wrong way, but it felt like a tour of history dressed up as a novel, that it was really about communicating historical information to the reader in the format of a fictional narrative.
Yeah, it's funny because this novel is the sequel to a novel that was set in Paris. It's called An American in Paris. It's being reissued by Cleus Press in a month or two.
I wondered about that when I saw it on your webpage.
Yeah. And that's the same kind of thing. I mean, when I wrote that, it was a long time ago. It was actually 25 years ago. And at that time, people had even less of a sense of these magnificent moments in sapphic history. You know, we're sort of much more well-versed in that now. So that one was very much a history lesson in effect about the salons in Paris, Natalie Barney, Gertrude Stein, Romaine Brooks, you know, all of these fabulous characters. And that purposely I was trying to fill in what was then a void. I don't think it's a void anymore. So the sequel now, which is Craze, it still has the feeling of that tour of history because it's the same narrator, you know, this art critic that's sort of wandering around the avant-garde salons, avant-garde being both a gendered and an aesthetic understanding of this sort of modern world. I wanted to maintain that flavor because I still think that there's a way in which our lack of understanding of to come back to what you said about the cycles of history, without being deeply and almost explicitly grounded in history in the way that you just said, we're going to lose sight of why that historical moment was relevant to us now. And as you know, you write historical novels in some ways because you're actually writing about the present. Mm-hmm. So I know that it's not so much pedagogical in terms of its historical, but it's very explicit. But that, I think that's the reason for it, is that it's actually a way to make sure that we understand the ways that this centennial celebration of the pansy craze, the queer craze, is actually relevant now, if that makes sense.
Uh-huh. And as you say that, every historical novel is in some way writing about the present. But I noticed that your viewpoint character talks and thinks about things in a 21st century filter, as it were. That I mean, as you specifically said, you're referring to the queer craze rather than the craze to make it more inclusive. But it also feels like it's to make it accessible to the contemporary reader in ways that the way 1920s people genuinely thought and talked about things would be less accessible because we're coming out of an era of a different kind of analysis of gender and sexuality.
It could be. I mean, I think this is really debatable because there is, Nightwood, Juna Barnes, and Orlando, Virginia Woolf. And if I read passages from them and then I read a passage from Craze, which if you like, I can do it, they're brief. They actually sound the same. So my feeling is, whether I read them or not, is that they were much more alike in their understanding of gender fluidity than we think they were. That is to say that in some ways, people think of gender politics and gender discourse as being progressive. And rather than that, it comes back to the cyclical idea. We are in many ways revisiting the way that they understood it. And that's where it makes it sound like it's a 21st century perspective, but I actually think it isn't. I actually had written the book earlier, an earlier version of it, to where the protagonist was later in history. And then I, as you know, from reading it, I took her back to 1934. And I took out all of the sort of more contemporary commentary so that it was more placed in that particular historical moment. But I understand why you're saying that, because they are so astonishingly like we are now that it makes it sound modern.
And speaking of astonishingly like, how autobiographical is this character? So I noticed, she was born out west. She goes to France. She ends up in New York City. That's got echoes in your own biography.
Yes.
Were you intentionally sort of projecting yourself through this character, or is that just what you were familiar with, so that's the background you gave her?
I thought when I was younger that I was allergic to autobiography, and then I realized everything is autobiographical. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. I wrote an Iraq War novel called Weapons of Mass Destruction. And, it's from the point of view of a Marine stuck in Fallujah during that horrific onslaught on the city. And it looks as far away from me as it possibly could be. And yet, at the core of that novel is this homoerotic relationship between these two characters who grew up in Montana. And there's a way in which that novel is almost as autobiographical as this one, because it's about the way in which we try to navigate through these oppressive, power structures. So I guess my short answer is to say that I certainly, like any writer, tap into my life, but that the choices that I'm making are more about what I'm trying to convey than a reflection of who I am. And in this case, I would think of somebody like Chapel Rowan, right, who comes from the Midwest and then moves to California and sort of tries to escape what is an oppressive American context, right? Because you end up, as a queer person, oftentimes in a bi-coastal setting. That has more to do with it than the fact that I happen to be from Idaho. It's about the way that we are. It's why the novel is set in New York City. We are not only predisposed, but almost forced to make geographical decisions. First, she goes to Paris, right? Because Paris was a kind of mecca for queer life, because the United States was so Puritan at the time. And then she ends up in New York, which has always been a queer Mecca. So yes, autobiographical, but really in service of trying to think about what we're up against as queer and lesbian people.
By the way, your New York City setting, I was amused because your upper class character that Henry has an affair with lives right around the corner from a very good friend of mine in the Upper West Side.
I love that.
I kept thinking, it's like, oh yeah, looking out over the park.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that character who lives on Fifth Avenue overlooking the park, right? It's just an example of who all were in those, queer spaces. I mean, she's a married, very wealthy socialite. And, nevertheless, there she is at the drag balls and in the queer speakeasies.
Mm-hmm. Because it was a time when, categories collapsed and people merged, as long as, as your book points out, as long as all of the rules are followed and all the hierarchies are not badly violated.
Yeah. And in that regard, there are discrepancies between then and now, insofar as that if the slummers, the so-called slummers, sampled the seafood, was one of the ways they thought about it. If they had a dalliance with a sailor at one of the queer speakeasies near the Brooklyn Navy Yard, it didn't then turn them into a homosexual. That is to say, something I referenced earlier, the category hadn't been invented in the way that we understand it now. I mean, I know that homosexuality has been invented, in effect, several times. Foucault talks about how it was invented as a classification in the context of the Enlightenment so that you could, punish and incarcerate, right, so-called categorically degenerate people. So there was an invention of it then, but then that particular understanding of it, in some ways, it melts away and you have this kind of free-for-all again, right? So that if you have a homosexual relationship, it doesn't make you into a homosexual. And then it's at the end of the queer craze that once again, we become a thing, and it's not just an action anymore, it's a thing. It's a being, not just an activity.
And it's also interesting that across time, the stigmatized aspects of same-sex relations have flipped and changed and rearranged depending on what the culture is, valorizing or deprecating. It makes me think about how, in this 1920s context, a man who, as long as he is acting in, trying to think of how to put this. So currently we have this attitude that someone who is being the active partner is homosexual. That is the person who is the othered category.
Yeah.
As opposed to, say, classical Rome, where a man who is going around, if you'll excuse the expression, sticking his dick in anything, he's a normal default man. He is not the other category, and so it's not meaningful. And one of the things that I hope to really get into in my source book is ways of thinking about this so that we can understand that, when we say we have always been here, that's putting an awful lot of weight on the word we. What is it that has always been here? And it's a mix and match and categories shifting and changing. And even if desires and acts and people have always been here, they were not clustered together in the same way. They were not connected in the same ways to think about as this is a thing, this is a thing.
Yes, I think the example of Rome is so interesting, the way you framed it, because, I mean, if we just say tops and bottoms with reference to men, so what you said about in Rome, the top was not the homosexual. Nobody was a homosexual. In the 20s, in the Roaring 20s, with the queer craze, the tops were not homosexual. The bottoms were starting to be thought of as pansies. It hadn't yet been codified to the extent that it is now, but we still weren't. I love the way you said that. we still weren't the we that we are now. And there's a way in which, when you said it's sort of overdetermined, and by the way, Oscar Wilde, as you know, he used the Greek defense, because he was like, I'm not gay. Like, what are you doing? Why are you throwing me in prison? I'm not gay. I'm Greek. But when you say that the we in some ways is overdetermined, it's interesting, because we now think, and this is relevant to the novel 100 years earlier, that somehow visibility is sort of unquestionably a good thing. But in a way, it's more complicated than that, because now that we're a we, not just because we are potentially more targeted, which may be the case, but that there's something about the we-ness of it, and even the proliferation of gender identities, that means that Virginia Woolf would say, we're over-determining gender in a way. That is, that by doing that, you're accentuating identities, and by accentuating identities, you're feeding back into a categorical understanding of what it means to be a homosexual. Right? There's an unfortunate tendency in there, something potentially dangerous. Another way to put it is that, I mean, this is what many younger queer people say now, that the idea that you're born that way, that kind of Lady Gaga song, understanding of being born queer, they say it was a strategy, that we had to call attention to ourselves in some ways and say, no, it wasn't a choice, because we needed to use that strategy to attain certain civil and social rights. But the strategy can backlash, because the strategy is potentially essentialist. And to go back to the 20s, that essentialism is why people got thrown in gas chambers, right? When history came crashing down.
Yeah, or psychiatric hospitals.
Exactly, right. And the medicalization of it, that's of course, right? And so, like, we need to, also getting back to why it feels like sort of overtly historical, a novel, that I think we really have to think more carefully about all of these tensions, because they're potentially dangerous.
Going from the specific to the more general, one of the things I've been noticing recently, because I do this thing where every month I put together a list of new and recent sapphic historical fiction.
Yeah, I saw that. That's great.
So that helps me notice trends. And I have been noticing that it feels like there's a lot of 1920s books coming out.
Yeah.
In fact, my spreadsheet, because I'm a spreadsheet person, and I pulled it up, and sure enough, in the up until 2020, I was running around 3% of all books were set in the 1920s. And this is not specific geography, but this is like across the board. And then starting in 2021, it jumps. And now for the last 4 years, 10% of sapphic fiction is set in the 1920s. And there's some specific themes depending on what the setting is. There's a lot of roaring 20s, jazz age, and then prohibition novels. For books set in England, there's a theme of the lost generation, and then especially women who were ambulance drivers in World War I, and that was their sapphic awakening. And then they become nurses, or they continue relationships that had come out of that. And so those are the themes that are specific to that era. But I think it's fascinating that we're just having this sudden focus, this intense focus on what was going on 100 years ago. And I think that that's no accident, that there is something about, thinking in terms, it gets back to our cycles of history thing, thinking in terms of what was the world like 100 years ago. And that's fascinating. Let's talk about it now. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
Well, add to that the pandemics, right? The Spanish flu and I really think that it's mirror images. I think that you can say in a more simplistic way, it's their centennial celebrations or just a kind of centennial interest. But I think, again, to think about historical novels really being about the present, I think it's the mirror images, not only in terms of, it's like the agony and the ecstasy of this flowering of queer culture, but the potential agony of the crackdown. So it's in the zeitgeist because you can't help but notice how uncannily alike these two periods are. And I think there's a great deal of anxiety, whether acknowledged consciously or not, in the air in terms of how bad is this backlash going to be. And we know that the last backlash was the worst backlash in history. I mean, it really is, you know, with the Holocaust and fascism, so that people, at least unconsciously, I think, are fearful, and they're trying to figure out what happened then. And if we can anatomize what happened then, maybe we can avoid that kind of history repeating itself. It's like if you know, if past is prologue, well, let's hope it's not prologue this time around. Let's get our act together.
Yeah, let's write a different revision of the story.
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
But yeah, you mentioned the pandemic, the Spanish flu pandemic, and when I read Emma Donohue's The Pull of the Stars, which is set in Ireland during the flu epidemic, that was very hard to read.
Yeah.
So much of it just, you know, it felt like recapitulation. It was like, you know, this is not history. This is not past. This is our present.
Yeah. And you think that, you know, in both cases, you know, you look at those pictures, those weird cones they had on their faces, you know, during the Spanish flu, or you think about, you know, until now we thought about, oh, it couldn't possibly happen again. What happened during, you know, the rise of fascism. But, you know, it never goes away. I mean, this is a constant struggle. And in the crosshairs of, you know, it's a struggle for freedom. And in the crosshairs of that struggle consistently are certain marginalized communities in particular, and we're one of them.
Yeah. And the sense that, you know, there's something essentially wrong with the world, and we need to find someone to blame. And if we can find the right people to blame and we can punish those people, then magically the world will become better again.
Yeah, and I think in Craze, it's a twofold. I mean, there's a line in particular. It says that, you know, with reference to the Jazz Age, that, you know, Puritan party poopers were punishing us for their guilty pleasures. So that's from the point of view of the ecstasy, part of the agony and the ecstasy. That really, when you do have these kind of unbridled desire among heterosexuals as well, so-called heterosexuals, that everybody is partying, and then there's a sense that there's going to be some sort of punishment, right? And Americans in particular are invested in this, and the punishment was seen as the Depression. You know, it's not just like, oh, you know, there's going to be a hurricane you know, in the wake of Mardi Gras idea. It's that actually, from a grand historical perspective, somehow the Jazz Age was punished by this horrible depression that ensued. And, you know, so that has to do with desire. And then in terms of the way in which, where does fascism come from? And a lot of times we think about it, as you say, it's, you know, they target marginalized communities, but there's a way in which it's this horrible, again, paradox, because it tends to rise not only out of fraught historical moments, but in the wake of freedom. That the freedom itself, it's like saying, you know, where did Trump come from? He comes from Obama. Where does this rise of fascism, potential fascism, come from now? It comes from a kind of golden age of American freedom. You know, if you look at the long view, it's, as you earlier referenced, the civil rights movement, it's a backlash. It's a 50-year cycle of that backlash. And we have to expect that. We have to understand that that's what history does.
Yeah, we need to be prepared for it before we're scrambling to keep up.
Yes.
And, you know, thinking about the cycles, you know, the previous cycle before that, you had the license and libertinism of the mid-18th century, which then, you know, led to revolutions. And there was a backlash then, right around 1800, where, especially in England, there was a sex panic. There was a sense of, you know, if we do not behave in a more moral and upright fashion, we will get a revolution just like the French did, and everything will be awful. And that was a direct precursor of, you know, the era that got Victoria's name slapped on it. You know, that you would have a era of more sexual liberty and more openness. And then you went into a much more repressive era where, you know, there was a women's rights movement in the late 18th century, and then it got slapped down because we need our separate spheres. We need women's place to be in the home. And again, that was a new reaction to something. I run into so often people thinking that history has been one long, slow, steady progress towards more progressivism and freedom and enlightenment. And it's like, no, we keep going back and forth and back and forth.
Yeah, that sort of whole arc of the moral universe argument.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing that remains consistent potentially is that what, implicit in what we're saying is that it's gender that's in the crosshairs. The crux of these power imbalances, the first line of attack is gender, whether it has to do with women, as you say, or with queer people. That's the consistent thing.
Yeah, there have been cycles of feminist thought over and over again across the centuries. And feminist thought has not always been progressive, in a bigger picture. That sometimes feminism, so Victorian feminism very often focused on women are more morally superior and therefore need to keep out of the public life.
Right. That the Virginia Woolf, who was not a feminist, neither was Gertrude Stein, Virginia Woolf said we were too sex conscious. And I find that so interesting because meaning that we pay too much attention to gender. And, there's a way in which that's sort of not to the point, because you need to pay attention to gender to get where you want to go, which is the final destination, maybe where she already was, that the final destination is to stop thinking about it, but we need to think about it in order to get there. And that's kind of where we are, I think, today with, non-binary identity. That's not where they were, I think, in the 1920s. I don't think they thought about it that way. I don't think they thought about gender the way that we do. I think they were sliding around. It's almost like, the lesbian continuum with Adrienne Rich, that they were just sliding around. There's a moment in the book where the Crystal, who's the protagonist's friend, and she's a former drag queen, who actually goes by she, and that she says, I'll sleep with anything. The only determinative gender is desire. I don't have to think of myself constantly as a homosexual. I have to think of myself as a desiring body, and that, I think that's more where people were then. I think they were less interested in identification and more interested in the potentially radical, impact of desire itself. And maybe that's more, in a way, radical than what we do now. That's an open question.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you say about, focusing on sex and gender, in my day job, one of the things we say is if you can't measure it, you can't change it. And I think that is relevant here, that if we want to get to a place where gender and sexuality don't matter, we have to pay attention to the ways in which gender and sexuality do matter currently.
That's a beautiful way to put it. But then the sort of concomitant danger is the Foucault thing, because he basically says that any category, it becomes a kind of box. It's counterproductive with reference to liberation, but that doesn't change at all what you said, because again, it's a strategy. It's like what the young people say about being born that way. It's a way to get where we want to go.
Yeah, well, I have to confess that I am not a fan of Foucault.
Mm-hmm.
I read his entire, work on sexuality, and was constantly making, I was basically hate reading it as they say these days, and making lots of notes about, it's like, does this man even know women exist?
Yeah. No, I agree to a large extent. It's like the way I feel about Freud, that they got so much wrong. And at the same time, when Foucault talks about the invention of homosexuality as we know it, then my ears perk up. But overall, yes, I think I see where you're coming from.
So you mentioned that your earlier novel about this character is going to be reissued. That's An American in Paris.
Yeah.
That's coming out from Playas Press. When will that be?
The audiobook will probably be available in about a month. and then the actual physical copy will probably be available in about 2 months. They're reissuing it on the heels of the sequel publication. So they're behind the curve because they needed to see the new novel in order to think that the 25-year-old novel was worth reissuing, but they have finally come around to that opinion. So I actually wonder if we can turn the tables, and if I could ask something of you, which is where you think we are with reference to lesbian fiction. There's that sort of funny question that people ask in literary circles, but is it any good? Where are we in lesbian fiction? Do we have our Michael Cunningham the Hours? Do we have a kind of sufficient canon of lesbian literature to where we are, so where do we stand in the literary marketplace given what's being produced and that has been produced in the lesbian canon?
That is a fascinating question, and it's something that comes up a fair amount. But my answer is that the lesbian fiction market, I will call it a market rather than a genre, it's still dealing with a lot of siloing. So, I use the phrase a walled garden sometimes, that, we had the small lesbian presses like Naiad and now Bella Books and Bold Strokes, and coming out of sort of what I call the little red hen movement. Nobody else is doing it, so we'll do it ourselves, and then we will eat the results ourselves as well. And that for a very long time, that part of the market was very isolated and self-sufficient. That, if you wanted to read lesbian fiction, you went to these publishers, you pretty much, it was a wasteland outside of that, and you knew what you were going to get, and that was where it was happening. And now, several things have broken that wide open. One, of course, is the rise of self-publishing and independent authors. So, with the rise of ebooks and the ease of self-publishing, that, it's no longer a walled garden. It's a walled garden, and all the wildflowers all over the hills struggling to, put their roots down. And it's less centralized. There's no longer a place you can go where you will find all of the lesbian books. But at the same time, the big presses, mainstream presses, and whether it's genre literature or literary presses, are much more open to publishing lesbian and sapphic books without that being the main thing it is. So casual queerness is much more scattered throughout the literary landscape. And as someone who is trying to put together this very focused list of sapphic historical fiction, this makes it very hard for me, because there is no one place I can go to say, oh, this publisher, I'll look at what they've got, this publisher, I'll look at what they've got. I can't guarantee that even if a book has a central sapphic relationship, that will show up in the promotional materials. It's like you need to reinvent Gaydar for books and look at how things are being described, say, it had LGBTQ as a keyword in Amazon, and that way of phrasing something is generally associated with, the two women are going to get together. So, we have, in expanding the scope of where sapphic characters are appearing in books, we have also fractured the discoverability of, for people like me who, that my go-to is, all other things being equal, if a book is, well written, has interesting characters and whatnot, I would prefer to read the ones with sapphic relationships. So there is, but it's not about a canon, because when I think about canon, I am thinking about purely the literary fiction. And, literary fiction is one genre of what's out there, but it's not the be all and end all. And very often it is not what people are looking for to feel like they're identifying with characters. The the sense that, if it's literary, it's dreary. It's not always the case, but uh, when you're coming out of, say, the romance market, and the romance genre, it has these requirements. There has to be a happy ending. You cannot kill off your main character's girlfriend and call it a romance. And so people who are looking for that, they're going to bounce off of literary books where it's not so much that it's always an unhappy ending, but you aren't guaranteed one. So when things get rough, it's like, do I want to finish this book? Is this book going to hurt me? And at the same time, you have other genres. So I'm very heavily involved in the science fiction fantasy genre. And casual queerness in science fiction fantasy is just a thing now. It is, any random book you picked up could have queer characters in it. Now, if it's a far future setting or it's an entirely different world, those queer characters do not have the same social context and history that we do. So it's a different type of identification. It's identifying, I have things in common with this character, or I can imagine myself being this character, but they are not coming out of the same place I am. And that's, again, a different kind of reading experience. To some extent, me personally, I like reading historical fiction for the sense of who I would have been in that era.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want it to be grounded in actual history, but I want it to be that subset of actual history where the characters do have happy endings. I guess I'll come back to summing it up as, expanding, but fracturing. That there is not a genre of, or a literary community of lesbian fiction. Now, of course, one organization that tries to, make those connections and create that discoverability is the Golden Crown Literary Society, which it has in recent years been breaking out of being solely focused on, the small queer presses, which when I first went to my first GCLS convention, it felt very much, it was part of that walled garden. It was part of that tradition of the small lesbian presses. And it was not looking outside of that. And one thing that I have seen now as a sort of an external observer is that they're working very hard to break that open and be much more expansive and, not walled off in the same way. But you still run into, somebody asks for recommendations for sapphic books, and what books you get recommended will depend on which community the recommender inhabits. And there's not always a lot of crossover. You ask for recommendations in science fiction and fantasy, you've got a solid half dozen books that are always the ones that are first recommended. You ask for recommendations within the lesbian fiction community, and you've got a solid half dozen authors that are always the ones that are first recommended. And they're different sets. And you're starting to get more awareness of crossover, more awareness of, making those cross connections between the reading communities. But it's not, it's still very siloed.
I wonder if the way you put it is, it's so vivid that there's a siloing and there's an expanding and there's a fracturing. And I wonder if with all of what you've said, we get lost in the shuffle. This would be my concern. And I think that there are certain voices in literature, whether it's canonical or not. I don't think that, Shakespeare, when he wrote, wasn't canonical per se. I think of it as a kind of after the fact canonization, because he was writing for regular people just as well as highbrow people. I just wonder if, consistently women's voices and queer voices, but especially lesbian voices, because it's queer and women coming together, if we're lost in the shuffle in spite of all of these expansions, And even with self-publishing, I mean, I celebrate it, and I really do. But at the same time, are we getting into the larger literary marketplace in any possible way, given what you've just said in that history and contemporary status of queer fiction that you've just outlined?
I think the people who are getting into the larger literary marketplace are a very specific set of authors. And this shows up in, when you get recommendations from people whose primary community they inhabit is that of literary fiction, then you get that specific set of authors. So you get Sarah Waters, you get Emma Donoghue, you get, I'm really awful at coming up with names off the top of my head. But
and in nonfiction, you get Sarah Schulman type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's a bad thing. One of the reasons for having different literary communities is that people are looking for different things in their books, in their reading. And that sense of, I want to go to an Italian restaurant and know I'm going to get pasta and not going to get chow mein.
Yeah.
I hope that was not an insensitive way to put it. But I think my impression is, and this is just an impression, that the people writing lesbian and sapphic characters in literary fiction are much less likely to identify themselves as queer writers. Well, not as queer writers, but much less likely to identify themselves as I am writing queer fiction.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
And, to some extent that may be still the influence of, publishers and publicists saying it's like, tone that down a little bit. We don't want to put people off of this book by telling them in advance that it's a queer book.
Yeah.
And that's definitely a thing. It's what I call the unbelievably coy book cover copy. And I guess to some extent I don't see where it's coming from, because the flip side of that is the 1-star reviews in Goodreads that say, you should have told me this book has queerness in it. So it's not like you're really getting an advantage by not telling people on the label what's in the book.
Yeah.
But I think I hear this time and again. It's like, well, I didn't talk about that aspect of the characters of the story in the publicity because it's not about that the characters are queer. That's not what the book's about.
Yeah.
These larger issues and whatnot. And I think there is still a bit of self-consciousness about that the sense that if you're writing queer fiction, you're not writing serious fiction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's my concern, is that as going back to what we sort of started with when we put the cart before the horse, which is that, to me, writing is intrinsically political, and non-binary gender fluidity, somewhat redundant, is political. And so I think of this question that we're exploring as a very important question insofar as it has to do with our material existence in the world. I'm concerned that we're still ghettoized to a certain extent, and that the possible impact of our fiction becoming a greater part of the literary marketplace would be a sign that we are not at risk as much as we are. That is, I want it to be an acknowledgement that to transcend these silos is a kind of barometer of how at risk or not we are. That's kind of my interest in the question. Yeah.
And I can give you a very specific impression. I won't say answer because I don't have truth, but a specific impression, which is looking specifically at the romance market,
Uh-huh.
and the traditional major publisher romance market. We are starting to get historical romance novels published by places like Harlequin that are sapphic romances. It is a very small number. One of the things that happens is if you are an author who already has a big audience, you've got a big readership for fiction, for other types of couples, then you can probably pitch a sapphic romance and have them willing to give it a try. Now, one of the things that happens is that, oh yeah, you can do that, but make it a novella, not a full novel.
Yeah.
It's pretty rare for people who are not already established romance authors to come out with sapphic novels. And when they do, it isn't, their existing fan base does not always embrace those novels.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big fan of KJ Charles, who primarily writes gay male historical romance. And she came out with one book, which was a female couple. And, it was a perfectly fine book, but her fan base did not embrace that book as, oh my God, another KJ Charles novel. I've seen any number of authors who have like an existing series of historic romance that may include male-female couples, it may include two men as couples, and then they'll put out a female couple as a self-published addendum to the series because they couldn't pitch it to their major publisher. It is pretty unusual for somebody who is writing primarily or only sapphic historical romance to get a deal from a major press if they are not already established in some way.
Yeah.
So one author who in fact has done this is Olivia Waite, who has this wonderful set of 3 books. There's not a series, but they're connected. I think it's called the Feminine Pursuit series. So these are Victorian era, Regency and Victorian era sapphic historical romance. And she has not been, an established, big name romance author before that, but she is an established big name book reviewer. And I do have to wonder whether she would have gotten the book deal without that. When I was first pitching my first novel, well, the first novel I got published, as opposed to the ones before that got rejected, I thought long and hard, I've got this historic fantasy novel, and I could either pitch it to a fantasy publisher or a lesbian publisher. I did a lot of research and I looked at what was being published, and at that time I said, I cannot guarantee that a mainstream fantasy publisher would treat this book the way I want it to be treated, because there was not, this breaking open, this greater acceptance. It was only just barely beginning at that time. And, looking backwards, if I'd been pitching the book like 3 years later, I might have made a different choice. But I didn't have a name, I was a complete unknown. I had this book, and I knew that if I sold it to a lesbian press, they would take seriously the story that it wanted to be.
Yeah.
And so this is authors making these decisions all the time.
Yeah. Well, that was moving. I mean, according to that example, we're sort of moving in the right direction. Yes. But I still think that we lesbians in particular, not queer at all, I'm saying very specifically lesbians, we're sort of the final frontier sapphic fiction of this literary marketplace, landscape. And I'm still concerned about it. I mean, I think that everything that you've said, there's sort of some good news, but there's still us being the final frontier. And I don't know what we're going to do about that. And it matters, again, to come back to it. It's not just aesthetic, ivory tower interrogation. It's something that's a barometer of where we stand in the world. And I wish we could figure out how to strategize and somehow change this dynamic, which has been around since, the dawn of the literary marketplace itself.
Well, I'll tell you, the one thing that I would like to see change in regard to that is I would like to see readers across all types of identifications and interests believe in their heart of hearts that women can have interesting stories.
Exactly.
Because I think that is one of the things that prevents the books that exist from having a larger readership and greater success. We got some pretty hard prejudices to get past before people are neutral with regard to the gender of the characters they're reading about.
Yeah. Actually, there's a way in which in Craze, the protagonist, as you know, she has two love interests. One of them is this, we said sort of high society, allegedly straight, but obviously not woman. So she has a certain cachet. And then the other one is this rakish, Heathcliff-esque, kind of sapphic underground character, barely sapphic.
And a marshmallow interior.
Right. And it's that marshmallow interior that's the ordinariness of what, in a way, sort of women and lesbian writers included saying, well, it's just not interesting, because when Henry, the protagonist, first sees the rakish Heathcliff-esque character unmasked, she's disappointed, because it becomes what you just said. It becomes ordinary and boring, and she has to transcend that prejudice, right, in order to fall in love with the thing that we're talking about, which is who we are. Like, we have to understand the interest, as does Henry, the intrinsic interest and the intrinsic sexiness of us, without having to dress it up.
Yep. Well, so this has been a fabulous conversation.
Thank you so much.
I originally was going to make this one of my short interviews as part of the On the Shelf podcast episode. And we were about 5 minutes into this interview, and I said, no, this is going to be an episode all on its own. And I was thinking, if you have any other projects that you've been working on or that you want to promote that you'd like to tell the audience about?
Well, I'm actually, so the prequel's coming out, American in Paris, from Cleus Press. I'm actually working on climate now. I'm taking a little break from the sapphic subject. So I'll finish the book I'm writing on climate, and then stay tuned, because there will be the third in the series of Henry's march through history. And then we'll have the sequel to Craze, and it will be Henry moving from the 30s probably up until the Stonewall era. So stay tuned for that, is what I would say.
Well, make sure you drop me a note when it's going.
Absolutely. We'll talk again.
And if people wanted to find you online or follow you on social media, where should they look?
So I'm at margaretvandenburg.com, and I think you have my Facebook address handy. I'm also on Facebook, and there will be notifications about events, obviously, and the new publications.
Well, I will make sure to put links to those in the show notes. And thank you again for coming on the show.
I really appreciate it, and everyone knows what you're doing for our community and for sapphic literature, and we're all very grateful.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that. I wish people would tell me that more often. Podcasting is a very lonely business.
I know, right? You're in your ivory tower over there, but not really. Everyone's listening.
Well, that's good to hear.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Lesbian Historic Motif Podcast. See the show notes for links to people and topics. Most shows will have a transcript linked as well. If you have a book announcement, a topic suggestion, or might like to appear on the show, please drop me an email. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate it and subscribe on your favorite podcast app, and consider supporting our Patreon.